Hey everyone, welcome back. In this screencast, I am going to try to step through the lab from last week. This one right here, the practice with CSS text control. This was a little bit of a free-form exercise. I didn't really provide a starting point or any content. The idea was just to create a simple HTML page and then style it, including adding a couple Google fonts to it. So I'm going to go ahead and step through that process. So if we go over to my text editor, again, I am using brackets. This is a free to use text editor available for Macs. So what I have here is a really basic web page here. The lab specified making sure that you had a couple headers. So I have an H1, I have an H2, got some paragraph text, I've got a list, I've got a couple links, and I've got a couple inline elements as well, a few M's here, and a strong, and then a span down here as well. So, I've got my HTML file with just some random content that I wrote. Now, before I add the CSS, I'm going to go ahead and open this in a browser. I attempted to use this feature in my previous screencast and it didn't work. It's because I needed to restart Brackets, my text editor. Hopefully it'll work right now. Brackets, some other text editors have this too. Brackets has this nice live preview feature. You click it, it opens your HTML file in a browser window. I think it defaults to Chrome. Or actually it might not even default to it. I think it only uses Chrome. So what's nice though is that as you make changes over here, so for example, if I changed that text, it's automatically changing it. I haven't even saved my HTML file. It's giving me a live dynamic preview of the changes that I'm making in the browser window. So that's going to be kind of nice, especially as we start to add CSS. Okay, so the first step here is to create your CSS file. I know that I'm going to pull in this CSS file using the external method. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my placeholder tags here. External CSS uses the link tag, and the link tag has two attributes that are required when we're pulling in a CSS file. The first one is the rel, short for relationship. The value is going to be style sheet, that is the relationship to this HTML file. Oops. And second attribute is href. This is going to be, I'm going to leave it blank right now because it's going to be the path to my CSS file. Of course, I haven't created it yet, so that's going to be my next step. I'm going to create a brand new blank file. And in fact, I'm not even going to put anything in it at the moment. I'm just going to go ahead, before I do anything else, I'm going to save it. Let's see, where is all my stuff? I am going to save this with the path to my CSS file. Save, come back here, refresh. Of course, I'm in the live preview, so I don't really have to refresh. Nothing's changed because I haven't actually added any CSS yet. So let's go ahead and add some CSS. Let me modify these windows so we can sort of see both things at the same time. I'm going to go back to my CSS, and I'm going to start with my headers. So I know in my HTML file that I have an H1 and I have an H2. So I'm going to go ahead and style those. Everything's pretty arbitrary at this point because we're skipping the whole design process. This is just an exercise, so we're just going to sort of make up the styles as we go. So with my H1, I'm going to go ahead and use the font size property, make this a little larger. Sorry that my video keeps jumping. I'm not sure why. I think I'm hitting a keyboard shortcut that's causing it to stop. Anyway, I've now added the font family property as well with my old standby font Verdana with the backup of Arial and sans serif. And we can see that's now been applied to my H1. Okay, cool. So I'm going to do something similar for my H2. Just going to copy that whole thing, put it here, use the same font, make my size a little smaller to be consistent. So now my headers use the same font, and they're a little larger than they would be by default, or a little different size, I should say. Of course, I can see here that there's some duplication. I'm repeating font family with the same exact values for both of these, so this is a great opportunity for me to use those grouped selectors. So I'm going to say for both H1, comma, which means and, H2s, use this style, font family Verdana. And that way I can get rid of it down here, and everything is just a little bit more efficient, so I don't have to duplicate that value. And again, because I'm using brackets with the live preview, this is updating for me as I go. If you're not using the live preview, obviously you just have to keep hitting refresh in your browser to see the changes as you go. Let's see. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do for my headers. I'm also going to specify a different font size for my paragraphs. So if I go back to my HTML file, all of my content is either inside of an H1, a P tag, there's another P tag, an H2, or part of this list right here. So all of my content is inside of an H1, an H2, a P, or an LI, a list item tag. I'm going to come back over here and specify a font size for my paragraphs. And maybe that's a little too big here. I'll make it 16. And for my list item content, I'm going to make that extra small. Again, just for sake of example. Okay, so I've specified font sizes for all of my content based on my document. Next thing I want to do here is, I don't actually like these fonts. I'd like to have a little more flexibility, so I've decided to use web fonts, and specifically Google Fonts. For more specifics on how to use Google Fonts, I do have a separate screencast for that, so I'm going to go sort of quickly through this. I'm going to go to the Google Fonts website, and I am going to select maybe this Oswald here. Select, and this Ubuntu. I should clarify too, for those of you that have looked at my Google Fonts screencast, what I am looking at right now is the old Google Fonts. You can see at the top it says, check out the new Google Fonts. The screencast that I have up is actually using the new Google Fonts interface. The same concepts apply. I'm still finding fonts and adding them to my selection here, and so I have Oswald and I have Ubuntu. So I'm going to copy the link code into my HTML document. Of course, we need to make sure it's within the header, the head section. We also want to make sure it's before the CSS file that's going to be referencing those fonts. So I've now copied in my basically my external style sheet pointing to Google Fonts. That's pulling in the data for the Oswald font and the Ubuntu font. So I'm going to save that. Go back over to my CSS. And now the second piece here is to use it. So you have to pull in the font files. So that's what this first thing does. Goes in your HTML file. And then in your CSS, wherever you want to use that font, I'm going to copy this font family reference here so I don't accidentally mistype. And I'm going to make all of my headers. Let me pull up my browser. I'm going to have all of my headers show up as this Oswald. Keep in mind that this blue here is just this live preview. It's highlighting what I have highlighted in my CSS. it knows that I have a group selector for both H1s and H2s, so it's showing me here's an H1, here's an H2. And it's applied that web font. I'm going to go back to Google for a moment. I'm going to copy the Ubuntu font because now I want to apply that font to my paragraph and list text. I'm going to go back to my CSS file, and I can do this in multiple ways. I can go to the paragraph style and the list style, do it that way. Or again, since it's essentially duplicated, I should say, I'm going to back up and go up here and say for all paragraph text and for all list item text, make it use the Ubuntu font, which I have pulled in from Google using this link tag. So now I have pretty quickly applied Google fonts to my document, and I can apply them using the font family CSS property wherever and however many times I want. Okay, so the last couple of things here. I'm going to now target my strong and M tags and apply different colors to each of those. So I'm going to, let's see, I've got an M tag there, and then my strong tag. Keep in mind, of course, in my CSS file here, this is how I'm formatting things. You can format it however you want. If this looks better to you, that's totally fine. Carriage returns, spaces, tabs, they don't matter. You just format it however it makes sense to you. You do need to think about the order of things, and that's getting more into those conflicts that may arise with CSS depending on where they are within your CSS document, depending on when things are pulled into your HTML file. So we are going to have conflicts, and that's what we're going to talk more about that next week. The lectures available this week start diving into that. Okay, so I am going to target the content inside any EM or emphasis tag, and I am going to make it, well, I'm just going to use a color keyword because I can't remember the hexadecimal values off the top of my head. So you can see my live preview automatically made anything that's inside of an M tag blue. And actually this is a little confusing because I do have some links here. Links are by default blue in all browsers, so I'm going to change this to purple just so we can distinguish. M tag, M tag, M tag. Going to make the content inside my strong tags green. So there we go right there. So it's as easy as that. Keep in mind the value you use for the color property can be one of these keywords. There are, I don't know, I think 20 some. It can also be a hexadecimal value. You can also use RGB. So we're going to come back to RGB colors a little later when we talk about transparency and background colors. But yeah, primarily you're going to use hexadecimal colors unless someone has given you the RGB values and it's easier to just type in that. Or if you want to have some transparency, in that case you actually have to use RGBs. So we'll talk about that more in depth when we talk about background colors. The other thing to keep in mind is the color property. Even though it doesn't have font in front of it, like these font size or font family, color always applies to the color of text. I'm making this distinction because we are going to see another property called background color soon, and that is going to apply to obviously the background of an element on the page, as opposed to color, which only applies to the text. Okay, so the other instruction in the lab was to target first to have a span tag, an instance of a span tag in your HTML document, and to target that and use a new CSS property. Okay, sorry about that. Something's happening with my screencast thing and it keeps stopping, so sorry for this abrupt jump. Okay, so we are styling the span tag. So I'm going to target span, that's my selector, and based on the instructions in the, if I can type here, in the lab, it says to use the text transform property. This is one we have not talked about in class. It was in the lecture notes from last week when we started, officially went online. So text transform, I actually use this property quite a lot. It allows you to, you can see the options. My editor sort of it knows I'm working with CSS because I saved it with a .css extension, so it's showing me the options. Notepad++ does this as well. So I'm going to make it uppercase. So I'm basically telling it to transform. Sorry, my dog is trying to get into my lap because apparently it's windy outside. It's a little distracting. So what we are doing here, oh, that's what it was. Okay, so they are completely free to use. So I have the span tags around free to use, and you can see it's a very small font, but it automatically uppercased that text. Although you can see that in my HTML it's all lowercase, but text transform will take whatever has been typed in there and it will automatically uppercase. If that's the value you've used, there's also capitalized, so it'll make the first letter of each word in the text selected uppercase. And I think there are a couple other options here too. Oh, you can automatically lowercase. That's another useful thing. So I often use that with my headers, but this example is pretty good too. Okay, the last thing we're going to do here is use these things called pseudo classes. If you go to the notes from last week, week 8, controlling text appearance with CSS part 2. I'm going to open that. Number 4 here, pseudo classes. So these, we're going to see these again over the next couple weeks. The most common use of these pseudo classes is for text styling. They always look like this. So a pseudo class is going to be something that's applied to a selector, and it has this colon and then a predefined name. So link, visited, hover, focus, active. The one I'm going to use here for this example is hover. So what we're going to do is we are going to, so if I go back to my HTML document, I've got a couple links. I've got a link here, and I've got a link here. So we can see both of these links. So both of these are just using the default browser styling. So unless you use CSS to override it, all browsers are going to make your links underlined and this sort of standard blue color, which is fine. But if you want to override that, you can use these pseudo classes to, well, first of all, you can just target the A selector or the A tag and style what the link looks like when it's just sitting there. In addition, we can use these pseudo classes to modify the different states of the link. So those states, if I go back over here, are what the link looks like when it's just sitting there, when it hasn't been interacted with, what it looks like if the user has already been to the page. Hover is the most helpful one. That's what happens when the user hovers over the link. Of course, keep in mind that is only relevant for desktop, not necessarily for a tablet or mobile. Focus is when you use the keyboard, like you tab through links and it gains focus on the link. And then active, I believe, is when you are actively, like I am clicking on this link right now. I don't know what that is. So when it's actively being clicked on. So I'm going to go ahead and style my links, and I'm going to use a pseudo class. Before that, though, I'm just going to target the A, the anchor tag, and tell my links. Let me open up my browser here so I can see while I'm going. I'm going to change the color to orange, and I'm going to use the text decoration property to remove that underline that automatically shows. So just those two properties, I have now changed what my links look like when they're just sitting there, sort of the default style. I removed the underline. All links have an underline by default. You can remove that if you want using text decoration, set it to none. And then I'm changing the color, the text color. Last thing I'm going to do here is use a pseudo class on the anchor tag. So my selector is the anchor tag. I'm going to add this pseudo class, hover, so a:hover, no space there can't be a space, so it's very important. And then you just add your properties. So I'm saying when the anchor tag is being hovered over, so not actively clicked, but when the user is hovering their link over, or hovering their cursor over the link, rather. At this point, I want to change, I don't know, I guess we haven't used red. I'll change the color to red, and I'm going to go ahead and add that underline back in. So I've essentially removed the default behavior for the normal state, and then I'm going to add it back in for the hover state. So to test it, I have to actually go over here and hover over my links. So this gives us a lot more control over how things are styled and makes things actually look a little more interactive as well. So this hover pseudo class we're going to come back to, and it's basically what we can use to convert a link. So these are just links, text links. We can use the hover tag pseudo class, you can use the hover pseudo class to essentially convert these simple text links into buttons. We can't do that, of course, until we go through background colors and paddings and margin. So that's going to be next week when we talk about the box model. So that is pretty much it. So this is basically the lab. I just wanted you to make sure you understood the basics of, how to apply CSS to an HTML document, how to bring it in as an external file, how to incorporate Google fonts, and then we also have played around with a couple new CSS properties. Of course, all of these properties so far that we've gone through are related to text formatting or text control. As I said, next week we're going to get into some different types of styles related to more layout type stuff. So that is about it. Last thing I will say is, again, don't forget to use your inspector tool. It's a great troubleshooting tool. And don't forget to use the validators, both HTML and the CSS validator, if something isn't quite working. For example, if you forget and you put a semicolon here and a colon there, in most cases your text editor, like mine, is going to say, hey, that's not right, something's going on there, so that's your first cue. But if you still can't find it, can't figure out what's going on, those validators are indispensable. So they will quickly point out where your syntax errors are, and then you can fix those and move forward. So that's about it. Sorry this is kind of long. I'm going to work on making these shorter and more concise. And again, if you have any feedback for me or any questions or want any help whatsoever, please email me. And I'll talk to you next week.